They called it the Kettle. Not the humans who built it. The humans had given it a proper name, stenciled it in white block letters along the pitted gray flank of the hull where the welds still showed their scorch marks. Terrestrial Vessel Resolute. But the Concord of Sapient Fleets, the great assembly of species that had watched Earth's little sun for 200 years, the way one watches an anthill before deciding whether to step on it, did not call the ship Resolute. They called it the Kettle because from a distance, through the long-range scopes of the survey cruisers that drifted past the edge of the human system, that was exactly what it looked like. A stubby, riveted cylinder with a bulge amidships and a nest of pipes bristling off the stern, venting slow curls of superheated vapor into the dark. A thing you might boil water in. A thing you might, at best, use to make tea. Lieutenant Junior Grade Mara Okonkwo-Vance was 24 years old, and she had spent the last 11 months of her life learning to love the kettle. She was strapped into the gunnery station on the vessel's cramped command deck, a space no larger than the galley of a fishing trawler, and she could feel the whole ship shudder around her as the fusion torch spun up for the trial burn. The vibration came up through the deck plates, through the acceleration couch, into her teeth. It was not a smooth vibration. Nothing about the Resolute was smooth. Every rivet, every seam, every hand-welded bracket sang its own note when the drive fired, and Mara had learned in 11 months to read those notes the way a mechanic reads an engine by ear. That flutter near the coolant manifold meant the number 3 pump was running hot again. That deep groan from below the deck meant the reactor shielding was flexing against its mounts, the way it always did, the way the engineers swore was perfectly fine and nothing to worry about. She did not entirely believe them, but she had stopped being afraid of it, which was a different thing, and in some ways a more useful one. "Torches stable," said the voice in her ear. That was Chief Petty Officer Idris Vane, down in the drive section, his voice flattened by the intercom and roughened by the perpetual cold he carried around like a pet. Stable being a relative term. She'll hold for the burn. "Copy, Chief." Mara ran her gloved hand across the gunnery board, checking the readouts one more time. The board was a patchwork thing, screens salvaged from 3 different manufacturers, buttons labeled in marker where the original stencils had worn away. Half the human fleet was built like this. All of the human fleet, really, because the human fleet was 11 ships old and the oldest of them had been a mining tug 6 years ago. That was the thing the Concord found so funny. That was the thing that made the survey crews laugh into their translator when they logged the Resolute specifications and sent them back to their homeworlds. Humanity had a warship, one, and it was a converted ore hauler with guns bolted onto it. Mara had read the intercepted transmissions. Everyone in the fleet had. The Concord did not bother to encrypt their contempt, perhaps because they wanted humanity to hear it, or perhaps because it simply did not occur to them that the anthill might be listening. There was a report from a VSHTI survey officer, a member of a species that built ships the size of moons, that had circulated through the human fleet until every crewman could recite it. The humans, the report said, have constructed what they describe as a vessel of war. It masses approximately 1/4000th of a standard VSHTI capital hull. Its primary armament appears to consist of chemically propelled solid projectiles. It has no gravitic screening, no phase armor, no coherent field defenses of any kind. The vessel's hull integrity is maintained by, and here the survey officer's translator had apparently struggled, by hope and adhesive. By hope and adhesive. The line had become a joke in the fleet, the kind of joke you tell so you don't have to feel the other thing underneath it. Someone had painted it on the wall of the Resolute's mess, hope and adhesive, in careful red letters, with a little cartoon of a smiling crewman holding a tube of glue. Mara walked past it 4 times a day. She had stopped finding it funny around month 6. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was, and because the truth of it sat differently in your stomach when you were the one strapped into the thing. "Command deck, this is Nav." A younger voice now tighter. That was Ensign Petro Havoc, 19, and on his first deployment, so new to the fleet that his uniform still had the factory creases in it. We are cleared for the burn window. Range control confirms the corridor is clear all the way out to the karst line. Understood, Nav. The captain's voice came from behind Mara, low and even. Captain Win Ajay was not an old man either, which was itself a symptom of how new the whole enterprise was. There were no old warship captains in the human fleet because there had been no human warships to grow old commanding. Ajay was 38, which made him ancient by the standards of the Resolute's crew, and he had the calm of a man who had already run every disaster through his head 100 times and decided he would rather die usefully than die surprised. Lieutenant Vance, weapons status. All batteries cold and safed, Captain, Mara said. Railguns loaded, feed systems nominal. The mag accelerators are drawing a little heavy on the port side, but they'll fire. They'll fire. Ajay let the words hang a moment. Everything on this ship will fire, Lieutenant. I'd like you to tell me someday that something on this ship will fire well. When we get a ship that fires well, sir, I'll be the first to tell you. A soft sound from the captain that might have been a laugh in a man less disciplined about his laughing. Fair, run the burn. The Resolute was not on that morning going to war. There was no war. There had never been a human war beyond the small, ugly wars humanity fought with itself, and the Concord had made it very clear in its patronizing way that it had no intention of fighting one either. Why would you go to war with an anthill? You simply waited and watched, and when the ants finally built something that mattered, you either taxed it or absorbed it, or, if it grew tiresome, you flooded the hill. The Concord had absorbed 11 species in its long history. Not one of them had required a shot to be fired. You did not fire shots at people who had already correctly understood that resistance was arithmetic and the arithmetic was against them. So the Resolute's mission that morning was a trial burn, nothing more. A long acceleration run out to the edge of the system, to the invisible boundary the navigators called the karst line, to prove that a converted ore hauler could hold together at combat velocities without shaking itself to pieces. It had failed this test twice already. The first time, a coolant line had ruptured, and they had limped home venting steam like a wounded whale. The second time, the reactor shielding had flexed so badly that the automatic safeties had scrammed the whole drive and left them coasting, powerless, for 6 hours while a repair crew crawled through the bilges. Both failures had been logged, no doubt, by the Concord survey ships that always seemed to be watching. Both had been fresh material for the reports that went home to the moon-sized hulls, fresh proof that the anthill's little war toy was exactly as pathetic as it looked. The burn began. Mara felt it in her spine first, the long, steady shove of acceleration as the fusion torch caught and held, and the whole ungainly mass of the Resolute began to move in earnest. 2 gravities. 3. The couch pressed up against her back like a hand. Around her the ship sang its 10,000 notes, and she listened, and for a while all of them were the right notes. The coolant pumps held. The shielding groaned but did not scream. The port mag accelerators drew heavy but stayed inside their limits. Mile after mile after mile, the Resolute drove out toward the dark, and Mara let herself think, against her better judgment, that maybe today was the day the Kettle held. Passing 30% of burn corridor, Havoc reported. His voice had steadied. Even the 19-year-old could feel it, the sense that something was going right. Velocity nominal, structural telemetry green across the board. Green, said Chief Vane from the drive section, in a tone that suggested he did not trust the color green and never had. Green means the sensors haven't noticed the problem yet. Thank you, Chief, Ajay said dryly. Your optimism is a light unto the fleet. Mara almost smiled, and that was when the proximity alert went off. It was not a loud sound. The Resolute's alert systems, like everything else on the ship, had been salvaged and jury-rigged, and the proximity klaxon was a repurposed industrial buzzer that sounded less like an alarm and more like a very annoyed insect. but every head on the command deck turned toward it, because in 11 months of trial burns nothing had ever tripped that alarm. There was nothing out here to trip it. The burn corridor was empty. Range control had confirmed it. Empty all the way out to the karst line and beyond. "Contact," Havoc said, and his voice had gone thin again. "Contact bearing, Captain. I have a contact dead ahead. Big, it's big. He stopped and Mara heard him swallow. "It wasn't there a second ago. It's there now." "Translate it in," Mara said quietly. She was already pulling the contact onto her gunnery board, and what she saw there made the skin on her arms go tight. It came in on a jump, right on top of the corridor. She looked at the mass reading and then looked at it again because she did not believe it the first time. "Captain, that's a Concord hull. That's a big one. Mass reads at—" She stopped because the number was absurd. "It reads at 4,000 times hours, give or take." 4,000 times. The exact number from the survey report. A standard VSHTI capital hull. For a moment nobody on the command deck said anything at all. The only sound was the singing of the ship and the annoyed insect buzz of the proximity alarm, which nobody had thought to silence. The thing ahead of them filled the forward scopes. It was the color of old bone, a vast smooth ellipsoid without a single visible seam or rivet, its surface rippling faintly with the telltale shimmer of gravitic screening. It did not so much fly through space as ignore it. Where the resolute clawed and shuddered and burned reaction massed to move, this thing simply repositioned reality until it was where it wanted to be. It was beautiful the way an avalanche is beautiful. It was the single most terrifying object Mara Okonkwo-Vance had ever seen, and she had grown up on a colony where the sky sometimes caught fire. Range, Ajay's voice had not changed. That was the thing about him. His voice never changed. 40,000 kilometers in closing, Havoc said. "They're, Captain, they're matching our vector. They're falling in alongside us." "Comms," Ajay said. "Are they hailing?" There was a pause. The comms officer was a soft-spoken woman named Reyes who spent most trial burns with nothing to do. Now she had something to do and Mara could hear her working. "They're hailing, sir. Broad spectrum. It's a general broadcast, not point to point. They're not talking to us specifically. They're talking to—" Reyes hesitated. "Sir, I think they're broadcasting to the whole system, and they're not encrypting." "Of course they're not," Ajay said. "Put it on." And the voice of the Concord filled the little command deck of the Kettle. It was a strange voice, layered, as though several throats spoke at once and the translator had stitched their meanings into human words with visible seams. It did not sound cruel. That was the thing Mara would remember afterward, the thing she would try to explain to people who had not been there. It did not sound cruel at all. It sounded bored. It sounded the way you might sound reading a shipping manifest. "Attention terrestrial system," the voice said. "This is the survey vessel Patient Contemplation of the 4th VSHTI Reconnaissance Wing, acting under the authority of the Concord of Sapient Fleets. We have observed your recent construction activity with interest. You have built a vessel you describe as a warship. We wish to inform you that this designation has been reviewed and denied. The object you have constructed does not meet the Concord's minimum threshold for classification as a vessel of war. It has been reclassified as a maritime curiosity." Mara heard Chief Vane's voice come over the intercom, very quietly, from down in the drive section. "A what?" "For the purposes of the historical record," the VSHTI voice continued, unhurried. "The Concord wishes it noted that no species in the recorded history of the Assembly has attempted to enter the community of war-capable peoples with an object of such—" the seams in the translation showed here, the machine reaching for a word, "such touching inadequacy. We do not say this to wound. We say it because your species appears to be laboring under a misapprehension about its own capabilities, and it is a kindness to correct such misapprehensions early, before they lead to embarrassment on a larger scale." "A kindness," Ajay repeated softly. He was watching the forward scope, watching the bone-colored mountain fall in alongside his shuddering little ship. How generous! To demonstrate the gulf between your capabilities and ours, the voice went on, and to spare your species the waste of further effort along this unpromising path, the patient contemplation will now conduct a brief demonstration. We will disable your vessel's propulsion. No harm will come to your crew. When your vessel is recovered, we trust the message will be understood. The Concord does not forbid you to dream of war. It merely asks that you dream more realistically. They're spinning up something, Mara said sharply. Her board had lit with a new energy signature, a bloom of gravitic force gathering along the flank of the VSH-TIE hull like a fist closing. Captain, they're targeting the drive section, some kind of gravitic lance. If that hits the reactor mounts. She did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. Everyone on the command deck knew what the reactor mounts were held together with. Hope and adhesive. And in the silence that followed, Captain Win Ajay did something that would, within a single standard week, be discussed on 1100 worlds. He unstrapped from his command couch, floated forward against the fading pull of the drive, and put his hand on the shoulder of a 24-year-old gunnery officer. "Lieutenant Vance," he said, "how well do you know this ship?" Mara looked up at him. Her mouth was dry. "Better than I know myself, sir." "Good," said the captain, "because I'm going to need you to do something the Concord has decided is impossible. And I'm going to need you to do it in the next 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Mara's mind did the thing it had learned to do in 11 months of watching the Kettle try to kill her. It stopped panicking, because panicking was a luxury and the Kettle did not permit luxuries, and it started counting parts, not weapons. The Resolute's weapons were a joke against gravitic screening. Her railguns would fire solid slugs into that shimmering bone-colored flank, and the slugs would slow and turn and drift away like leaves in a stream. Everyone knew that. The Concord knew that. That was the whole point of the demonstration, to prove the joke was a joke. But the captain had not asked her about the weapons. He had asked her how well she knew the ship. "They're going to fire a gravitic lance," Mara said, thinking out loud, her hands already moving across the patchwork board. "Focused gravitational shear, aimed at our drive section. It's a precision weapon. It has to be. They said no harm to the crew. That means they're threading a needle. They're going to reach past our hull and grab the reactor mount specifically." "Which means," Ajay said, following her, "they've mapped us." "They've mapped us," Mara agreed, and there it was, the thread, the loose thread she could pull. "They ran a survey scan before they hailed us. They know exactly where our reactor is. They know exactly where the mounts are. That's how they can promise not to hurt us. They're not guessing. They've got a full internal model of this ship." She looked up. "Captain, their model is wrong." Ajay's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "How wrong?" "Their model is of the Resolute as she was designed," Mara said, the words coming faster now. "As she reads on the specification plates, but we've never once flown her as designed. Nothing on this ship is where the blueprints say it is. We moved the primary reactor mounts 3 months ago after the second scram. Chief Vane rebuilt the whole cradle by hand because the original geometry was flexing. The thing they think is our reactor mount is a decoy. It's the old cradle. It's empty. It's holding a coolant tank now." For one long second, the command deck was silent, except for the annoyed insect buzz. "Say that again," said Chief Vane's voice over the intercom very slowly. "The reactor's not where the blueprints say, Chief. You moved it. You moved it, and we never updated the fleet registry because the paperwork's a nightmare and nobody cared. The Concord pulled our specs off the registry. They're aiming at an empty cradle." "They're aiming at a coolant tank," Vane breathed. "If that lance hits the old mount," Mara said, "it grabs a tank of pressurized coolant and rips it out of a ship that isn't structurally depending on it anymore. It'll make a hell of a mess. It'll vent half our reserve. But it won't touch the drive. The drive keeps running." Ajay was already moving back toward his couch. "How long until they fire?" Mara checked the energy bloom on her board. It was tightening, focusing, the gravitic fist drawing back to strike. 60 seconds. Maybe less. And when they fire and nothing happens, when their impossible weapon hits our impossible ship and we keep flying, Ajay strapped in. His voice was still even, but there was something underneath it now, something that had not been there before. What do we do with the 60 seconds after that? And this was the moment. Mara understood it even as it was happening, understood that everything before this had been prologue and everything after would be consequence. Because the captain was not asking her how to survive. Surviving was easy. They would survive whether they did anything clever or not. The coolant tank would take the hit, and the Kettle would sail on wounded but alive. The captain was asking her something else. He was asking her whether a converted ore hauler with guns bolted on, a maritime curiosity, a thing held together with hope and adhesive, could do something to a moon-sized warship that the moon-sized warship's crew would remember. Not destroy it. Nobody was destroying anything today. But there is a difference between a creature that cannot bite and a creature that will not bite, and the Concord had spent 200 years assuming humanity was the first kind, and Mara Okonkwo-Vance suddenly and fiercely wanted to show them they had made a category error. "Chief," she said, "the port mag accelerators, the ones drawing heavy, why are they drawing heavy?" Vane answered instantly. He'd been chewing on that fault for weeks. "Bad capacitor bank. It's dumping current instead of storing it. I've been meaning to swap it out. It's the reason we throttle the port battery to 60%, so it doesn't cook itself." "But it can dump the current," Mara said. "It can dump all of it at once." A pause. "It can do exactly one thing well, Lieutenant, and that's blow itself up in a big bright flash of—" Vane stopped. Oh, you absolute maniac." "Somebody explain it to the rest of us," Ajay said. Mara was already rerouting power on her board, her fingers flying across mismatched screens. "The VSH-TIE hull has gravitic screening. It bends the path of anything solid we throw at it. Slugs, missiles, doesn't matter, the screening turns them aside. It's a wall we can't punch through. But the screening bends mass and momentum. It doesn't stop light. It doesn't stop electromagnetic radiation. It can't, or their own sensors wouldn't work through it." She looked up, and for the first time that morning there was something almost like a smile on her face, thin and hard. "The bad capacitor bank on the port battery is a fault, but if I dump the whole port mag accelerator array through it at once, deliberately, all of it, in a single uncontrolled discharge, you get an electromagnetic pulse," Vane said. "A huge one, directed, right down the throat of their sensor array." "They came in on a jump," Mara said. "Point blank. 40,000 kilometers. That's knife range for something their size. Their sensors are wide open because they're this close and they think we're a curiosity. They're not shielded against us because nothing we have is supposed to matter." She locked the last routing into place. "We can't hurt their hull, but we can blind them. We can flood their sensor array with more raw electromagnetic energy than they've ever taken from a hostile source, because no hostile source has ever gotten this close to a VSH-TIE capital ship, because nobody's ever been stupid enough to let one this close." Ajay looked at her for a long moment. "That's going to destroy the port battery." "Completely," Mara said. "It'll never fire again. We'll limp home on one gun." "And when we blind them, what does that get us? They recover in minutes. We can't run, they'll just jump ahead of us again." "We don't run," Mara said. "That's the whole point. We don't run and we don't die and we don't get disabled and we blind their sensors at knife range in the same instant their impossible weapon fails to do anything to us at all." She met his eyes. "Captain, they're not here to fight us. They're here to make a point. They're here to prove to the whole system, to 1,100 worlds, that the human warship is a joke. They're broadcasting this, on purpose, unencrypted." Her voice dropped. "So let's give them a broadcast. Let's make sure that when the patient contemplation fires its lance at our ghost, and its sensors go white, and it loses lock on a maritime curiosity 40,000 kilometers away, Let's make sure everyone in this system is watching. The forward scope showed the gravitic fist drawn all the way back now. 30 seconds. 20. Captain Win Ajay was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he keyed the ship-wide channel, and his even, unchanging voice went out to every soul aboard the Resolute. All hands, this is the captain. In 15 seconds, a Concord warship is going to shoot at us. It's going to miss because Lieutenant Vance is cleverer than 4,000 times our tonnage. When it misses, we are going to do something no human ship has ever done. We are going to make the Concord flinch. Brace for hard discharge on the port battery. Chief Vane, on my mark, dump the port array. Standing by, Captain, Vane said, and there was something in the old chief's voice that Mara had never heard in 11 months. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was joy. Comms, Ajay said, raise. Are they still broadcasting to the whole system? Still broadcasting, sir. Every ear in the system's on this channel. Good, said the captain. Leave our transmitter open. I want them to hear us too. And then the patient contemplation fired its gravitic lance. Mara saw it on her board more than she felt it. A lance of pure gravitational shear, invisible, silent, a spear of bent spacetime that lanced out from the VSH-TIE hull and struck the Resolute exactly where the specifications said her reactor mounts were. Exactly where the empty cradle waited. Exactly where a fat tank of pressurized coolant sat holding nothing important together. The ship screamed. A real scream this time, metal tearing, the whole aft third of the Resolute shuddering as the lance grabbed the old cradle and wrenched. On Mara's board a cascade of red alarms bloomed. Hull breach in the aft coolant bay, pressure loss. A great white plume of vented coolant blasting out into space in a cloud that must have been visible across half the system. The Kettle bucked and rolled, and for one sickening moment Mara thought she'd been wrong, that the whole thing was coming apart. And then the ship steadied. The fusion torch never even flickered. Deep below the deck, in the cradle Chief Vane had built with his own hands 3 months ago because he did not trust the blueprints, the reactor kept burning, untouched, exactly where no one on the patient contemplation knew to look. Drive holding, Vane's voice roared over the intercom. We lost the aft coolant bay, we're venting reserve, but the drive is holding. She's flying, Captain. The Kettle's flying. On the broadcast channel, the layered, bored voice of the VSH-TIE survey master faltered. For the first time, it faltered. Anomalous result. Recalibrating. The target vessel's propulsion appears to remain. This is inconsistent with the survey model. Stand by. They're confused, Reyes reported, and there was fierce delight in her voice. Their whole broadcast just went sideways. The whole system heard them say it. Inconsistent with the survey model, on an open channel. Ajay's hand was over the fire control key. The VSH-TIE hull hung 40,000 kilometers away, vast and bone-colored, and for this one impossible sliver of time, wrong-footed, its sensors wide open, its crew scrambling to understand why the anthill's toy had not broken. Chief Vane, said Captain Ajay. Ready, sir. Lieutenant Vance, is your solution locked? Mara's finger hovered over the discharge control. The entire port mag accelerator array was routed through one failing capacitor bank, primed to dump every joule it held in a single blinding pulse aimed straight down the throat of a warship, 4,000 times their size. Locked, Captain, she said. All I need is the mark. Then let's introduce ourselves properly, said Win Ajay. Mark. To understand why the crew of the Resolute did not simply die that morning, you have to understand who they were. And to understand who they were, you have to go back 11 months, to the day the ore hauler stopped being an ore hauler and started, against all reason and most expert opinion, becoming a warship. Mara Okonkwo-Vance had not asked to be there. That was the truth she rarely told anyone. She had grown up on the colony of Sekhmet, a hot, bright world too close to its sun, where the sky sometimes ignited in the upper atmosphere, and children learned to read the color of the horizon, the way other children learn to read a clock. She had wanted to be an atmosphere engineer, one of the quiet, clever people who kept the colony's air breathable and its heat survivable, who fought a daily improvised war against a planet that did not want humans on it. She had been good at it. She had been good at exactly the thing that would, years later, save every soul aboard the Kettle. The art of keeping a system running long past the point where the specifications said it should have failed, using whatever was to hand, trusting her own understanding over the manual. The recruiters had come looking for people like her. Not soldiers. Humanity had soldiers, and the soldiers were mostly useless for this, because the first human warship did not need people who could shoot. It needed people who could keep an impossible machine alive. It needed engineers who thought like fighters and fighters who thought like engineers, and there were not many of those, and Mara Okonkwo-Vance was one of them, and so she had been asked, very politely, to leave the world she loved and go learn to love a ship instead. She had hated the Resolute for the first month. Everyone did. The ship was a converted ore hauler, and it showed its origins in every seam. The cargo bays crudely bulkheaded into crew quarters, the mining lasers ripped out and railguns bolted in, the reactor that had been sized to run drilling rigs now asked to feed weapons it was never meant to feed. Nothing worked the way it should. Everything had to be coaxed, bullied, understood. The ship was, in the most literal sense, a prototype, and prototypes are cruel teachers. But somewhere in the second month, coaxing a coolant pump back to life at 3 in the morning with the whole drive section frozen and cursing around her, Mara had felt the thing turn over inside her. She had understood the Kettle, not the way an operator understands a machine, but the way an atmosphere engineer understands a hostile planet, as a system with its own logic, its own moods, its own 1,000 small ways of trying to kill you that you learn to anticipate and forgive. And once you understand a thing that thoroughly, you cannot help but love it, even if it is trying to kill you, perhaps especially then. Chief Idris Vane had understood this before she did. Vane was the closest thing the Resolute had to an elder, a lifelong drive engineer who had spent 20 years on real ore haulers before the fleet drafted him to teach a warship how to breathe. He was the one who had rebuilt the reactor cradle by hand after the second scram, working off no blueprint at all, off nothing but his own understanding of where the stresses actually ran versus where the drawings said they ran. When Mara had asked him why he hadn't filed the change with the fleet registry, he had looked at her like she'd asked why he hadn't written a poem about it. "The registry's for people who weren't here," he'd said. "I was here. I know where the reactor is. You know where the reactor is. The people who need to fight this ship know where the reactor is. Everybody who matters knows. The registry can catch up when it catches up." That casual contempt for the paperwork, that instinct to trust the people who understood the machine over the official record of the machine, had, 3 months later, made the Concord's perfect survey model into a lie. But nobody knew that yet. On the day Vane rebuilt the cradle, it was just an old engineer trusting his hands over a document. It was just a human being human. And Captain Win Ajay had understood all of them. That was his gift, the thing that made him a captain of a warship at 38 when there had been no warships to captain until a few years ago. Ajay was not a brilliant tactician. He would have said so himself. He had studied the Concord ships and known, coldly, that in any straight fight the human fleet would be annihilated. What he had was something rarer than tactical brilliance. He had the ability to build a crew that trusted itself, to take a gunnery officer who thought like an atmosphere engineer and a drive chief, who ignored the registry and a 19-year-old navigator on his first cruise, and to weld them into something that could improvise together, at speed, under fire, without needing to explain themselves. He had spent 11 months teaching them to trust that when one of them saw a solution, the others would move. And that trust, invisible on any survey scan, unmodelable, unmeasurable, was the real weapon the Resolute carried into the encounter with the patient contemplation. The Concord had scanned the Resolute 100 times. It had measured her mass and her armament and her energy budget and her hull integrity. It had built a model so precise it could aim a gravitic lance at a specific bracket 40,000 kilometers away. It had never once scanned the thing that mattered. It could not. There was no sensor in the Concord's vast and ancient catalog that could measure the way a crew of 5 improvised humans trusted each other. There was no reading for hope. There was no gauge for the particular human genius of a species that had grown up on hostile worlds, keeping broken systems alive with whatever was to hand. The Concord had measured everything about the Resolute except the only things that could hurt it, and it had done so with the serene confidence of a civilization that had never, in 900 years, met an enemy it could not measure. This was the mistake. This was always going to be the mistake. And on the morning of the third trial burn, 40,000 kilometers from a moon-sized warship, a 24-year-old atmosphere engineer who had learned to love a ship that kept trying to kill her, was about to make the Concord pay for 900 years of measuring the wrong things. Mara pressed the control. For an instant nothing happened, and in that instant she had time to be afraid that the theory was wrong, that the screening would eat the pulse the way it ate everything else, that the whole desperate gamble was about to become another line in another survey report. The humans attempted a directed electromagnetic discharge. It, too, was inadequate. Then the port mag accelerator array dumped its entire stored charge through a capacitor bank that had been begging to die for weeks. And the bank died gloriously, and it took the whole array with it in a single directed torrent of electromagnetic energy that leapt across 40,000 kilometers at the speed of light and struck the patient contemplation sensor array in a wave. Mara felt the port battery die. It was a physical thing, a bang from the ship's flank that she felt in her sternum, a fresh cascade of red on her board as the entire port weapon system went dark and stayed dark, cooked to slag, exactly as she had promised. The lights on the command deck browned out and staggered back. Somewhere a fuse popped and Ensign Havoc yelped. And on the forward scope, the impossible thing happened. The patient contemplation went blind. Mara watched it on her board, and she would spend the rest of her life describing this moment to people who had not seen it and would never quite believe her. The gravitic screening on the HFY hull, that beautiful shimmering skin that turned aside every solid thing, flared and rippled and cascaded as the electromagnetic wave washed across it. Because the screening had never been designed to stop light, could not stop light, and behind it the delicate sensor array that let a moon-sized warship see, the universe took the full brunt of a directed pulse at knife range and simply stopped seeing. The vast bone-colored ship shuddered. Its running lights flickered. Along its flank, whole banks of sensor blisters went dark, and Mara imagined, 40,000 kilometers away, a bridge full of HFY officers watching their screens fill with white noise, their maps of the local space evaporate, their perfect model of the universe collapse into static. "Their sensors are down," Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Their whole forward array is down. They're blind, Captain. A Concord capital ship is blind, and we did it." On the broadcast channel, the layered voice was gone. In its place was chaos, overlapping fragments of HFY speech, half-translated, tumbling over each other. The survey master's careful, bored diction had dissolved entirely. "Loss of primary array, all bands. What is the origin of this? The curiosity, it came from the curiosity. Impossible, its energy budget cannot support. It did support it. The readings before the loss showed. We are blind on the forward hemisphere." "They're still broadcasting," Reyes said, and now she was laughing, a wild, disbelieving laugh, because the whole thing was still going out unencrypted to every world in the system. "They forgot to cut the channel. The whole system is hearing this. The whole system just heard a VSH-TIE capital ship say we are blind. Captain Ajay did not laugh. He was watching the crippled giant on his scope with the flat attention of a man doing arithmetic, and Mara realized he was already 3 moves ahead of the rest of them, already in the next problem while they were still savoring the last one. They'll recover, he said. Their aft sensors are intact. They'll rotate the hull, bring their good array to bear, and in 90 seconds they'll have a lock on us again. And when they do, they will not be embarrassed anymore. They will be angry. And an angry Concord warship does not fire a precision lance at a coolant tank. It fires whatever it fires when it has stopped being polite. He looked at Mara. We have 90 seconds and 1 working gun and no more clever tricks with the port array because the port array is gone. Lieutenant, what's left? And Mara Okonkwo-Vance, 24 years old, strapped into a gunnery station on a converted or hauler, felt the whole weight of it land on her. Because the captain was right. The trick was a trick. It worked once. It had cost them half their weapons and all of their coolant reserve, and it had bought them exactly one thing, 90 seconds and the knowledge that the giant could be hurt. But hurting a giant's eyes is not the same as beating it, and in 90 seconds the giant would open its good eye and it would not be laughing anymore. She looked at her board. 1 railgun battery, starboard side, feed nominal, a hull venting coolant into space, a drive that was holding but running hot, always running hot. And a Concord warship 4,000 times their size, blind on one side, rotating slowly to bring its good sensors around, its patience finally, catastrophically exhausted. Chief, she said slowly, how much coolant did we lose? Most of the aft reserve, Vane said. We're running on the primary loop only. Lieutenant, if you're about to ask this ship to do something that generates heat, the answer is she can't take much. We're 1 hard burn from cooking the drive. I'm not going to ask her to generate heat, Mara said. I'm going to ask her to dump it. She was staring at the cloud on her scope now. The great white plume of vented coolant, tons of it, expanding out from the Resolute's wounded flank into a vast diffuse fog that hung in space between the Kettle and the blinded giant, glittering, freezing, spreading. Thousands of kilometers of it already. The wound the VSH-TIE lance had made. The mess she'd promised would be spectacular. Captain, she said, when they rotate their good sensors around, what's the first thing they'll do? Reacquire us, Ajay said. Get a lock, get a firing solution. They'll get a lock by looking for our drive plume, our fusion torch. It's the brightest thing about us. It's the only bright thing about us. In the dark against the cold, our torch is a bonfire. She pulled up the thermal picture, and there it was, the Resolute's whole thermal signature dominated by the searing bloom of the drive. That's how they find us, that's how anything finds us. And right now between us and them, she gestured at the coolant cloud, is a fog of superheated vapor cooling as it expands, tons of it, ionized, reflective, a cloud of our own coolant sitting right in their line of fire. Vane got it first, the way he always got it first, because he understood the ship's plumbing better than he understood his own hands. You want to hide the torch in the cloud. I want to do better than hide it, Mara said. I want to give them 10 of it. She was working fast now, rerouting, calculating, and the plan was assembling itself in her head faster than she could speak it. The cloud is ionized vapor. It reflects. If I vent the rest of our primary coolant loop in short pulses through the maneuvering thrusters, if I paint the inside of that cloud with hot gas in bursts, every burst lights up the cloud from inside. To their thermal sensors, every hot spot in that fog looks like a drive plume. Looks like us. We become one signature in a cloud of a dozen false ones, and they're already half-blind, already rattled, already broadcasting their confusion to the whole system. She looked up. When they open their good eye, they won't see the Kettle. They'll see a swarm. They'll see a dozen ships where there's one, and they won't know which is real, and every world in this system will watch them not know. That's the last of our coolant, Vane said quietly. You dump the primary loop, we've got nothing. The drive cooks itself in, He did the math. 8 minutes, maybe 10. Then in 8 minutes this is over one way or the other, Mara said. The command deck was silent. On the scope, the patient contemplation had nearly finished its slow rotation. Its good sensors were coming around. In seconds it would see again, and what it saw would decide everything. Ajay looked at his young gunnery officer for what felt to Mara like a very long time. Then he keyed the ship-wide channel one more time. All hands brace, we're venting the primary loop. Chief Vane on Lieutenant Vance's mark. Everyone else, he paused. Everyone else know that whatever the Concord thought they were coming here to prove today, they are going to leave this system having proved the opposite. Vance, it's your ship. Take the shot. Your ship. Mara felt the words land somewhere deep. Chief, she said, venting primary loop through maneuvering thrusters, pulsed pattern on my count. 3, 2, 1, vent. And the Resolute began to breathe fire into the fog. Mara had programmed the pattern herself. A stuttering sequence of coolant pulses fired out through the maneuvering thrusters into the vast expanding cloud, and she watched on her thermal board as the fog lit up from within. First one hot bloom, then 3, then 7, then a dozen, each one flaring bright and hot and drive-shaped, each one a ghost of the Resolute scattered through thousands of kilometers of glittering vapor. The real Kettle was one signature among them, its true drive plume no brighter than the decoys, no more distinct, one flame in a bonfire of flames. And the patient contemplation opened its good eye. Mara watched it happen. She watched the aft sensor array come fully around, watched the moon-sized warship's attention swing back toward the little human ship it had come to humiliate. And she watched, on the broadcast channel that the HFY had still not thought to close, the exact moment the giant saw the swarm. The layered voice returned, but it did not sound bored anymore. It did not sound like a shipping manifest. It sounded, for the first time in the recorded history of humanity's contact with the Concord of Sapient Fleets, uncertain. Requiring target, multiple contacts, correction, multiple drive signatures, the count is increasing. This does not match a single vessel. Where did they come from? Are there more of them? Were there always more of them? Ray's made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. Captain, the whole system heard that. Every world. Were there always more of them? A HFY survey master just asked, on an open channel, whether humanity has a fleet they never detected. And they can't be sure we don't, Mara said softly. That's the thing, that's the whole thing. They came here certain. Certain we were a joke, certain they had us mapped, certain there was one crude little ship and nothing else. And in the last 2 minutes everything they were certain about turned out to be wrong. Their weapon missed, their sensors failed, and now there's a swarm where there was supposed to be a curiosity. She watched the dozen false drive plumes burn in the fog. They don't know what we are anymore, and a thing that doesn't know what you are is a thing that has to consider that you might be dangerous. On the scope, the patient contemplation had stopped rotating. It hung in space, vast and bone-colored and blind on one side and confused on the other, and it did not fire. It did not fire because it no longer knew where to fire, or how many things it would have to fire at, or what those things might do if it missed again. For the first time, the giant hesitated. And Captain Win Ajay, watching a moon-sized warship hesitate before a converted ore hauler held together with hope and adhesive, finally, quietly, allowed himself to smile. But the encounter was not over when the giant hesitated. That was the thing the later accounts sometimes smoothed away, in the telling and retelling, in the way legends sand down their own rough edges. The patient contemplation hesitated, but a hesitation is not a surrender, and in the 11 seconds before the HFY chose their words, the encounter came within a hair of turning into a massacre. Because the patient contemplation tried, once, to fight back. Mara caught it on her board before anyone else, the way she caught everything first, because she was the only one watching the enemy's energy signatures instead of watching the miracle they had just performed. In the middle of the giant's confusion, a fresh bloom of power gathered along its intact aft flank, not the precise, threaded lance of before, but something wider, cruder, angrier. A defensive sweep. The VSHI could not see through the fog of false plumes, could not pick the real Resolute out of the swarm, and so a frightened capital ship did what frightened things do. It stopped trying to aim. It prepared to hose the entire cloud. "Captain," Mara's voice cut across the command deck's exhausted euphoria like a blade. "They're spinning up a wide area weapon. Aft battery. They can't find us, so they're going to saturate the whole cloud. Every plume, real and false. If that fires, it doesn't matter that they can't tell which one we are. They're going to hit all of them." The euphoria died instantly. Havoc's face went white. Ray's hands froze over the comms board. "Time to fire?" Ajay asked. 8 seconds, maybe 7. Mara's mind was already sprinting, already tearing through the ship's dying systems for anything at all. But there was nothing left. The port battery was slag. The coolant was venting. The one working railgun could no more stop a wide area gravitic sweep than a thrown stone could stop the tide. They had spent every trick. They had spent every gram of cleverness the Kettle had in her. And now a frightened giant was about to erase them by accident. And there was nothing. And then Mara understood the one thing left. The only thing left. It was not a weapon. It was not a trick. It was the truth, and it was the most dangerous thing she had ever considered doing, and she had perhaps 5 seconds to decide whether to gamble every life on the ship on the character of an enemy she had known for 4 minutes. "Raise," she said. "Open the channel now, broadcast." "Lieutenant." "Now raise." Mara's voice did not shake, though everything in her was shaking. "Patient contemplation, this is Resolute. Hold your fire. You are about to make an error you cannot take back, and I am going to tell you exactly what it is because I do not want you to make it." The words came fast and clear. "You are preparing a wide area discharge into the cloud because you cannot resolve our position. Do not. Listen to me. You said no harm to our crew. You said it on an open channel to 1100 worlds. You made that promise before you knew we could bite, and now that we have bitten you want to take it back. And I am telling you, if you fire that weapon, if you saturate this cloud and kill this crew after promising you would not, the record that goes home is not that the humans were dangerous. The record that goes home is that the VSHI gave their word to a weaker species and broke it out of fear. Every world listening will hear it. Every member of the Concord will know that the 4th Reconnaissance Wing made a promise and broke it the moment the promise became inconvenient. She let one breath pass. You are not just deciding whether to kill us. You are deciding what kind of people the VSHI are in front of the entire assembly on an open channel right now. Choose carefully. Resolute out. She closed the channel. Her whole body was one taut wire. 6 seconds, Havoc whispered. 5. Nothing on the scope changed. The power bloom on the VSHI's aft flank held, gathering terrible. 4. "Come on," Vane breathed over the intercom. "Come on, you ancient bastards, be better than your fear." 3. And the bloom collapsed. Mara watched the energy signature drain away from the giant's aft battery, watched the wide area weapon stand down, watched a moon-sized warship choose, in the space of a held breath, to keep a promise it had made to a species it had come to mock. And she understood in that moment, something that she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people who thought this had been a story about weapons. It had never been a story about weapons. The VSHI had come to prove humanity was beneath them. And when the encounter turned, when the anthill's toy proved it could hurt them, they had faced the same choice every powerful thing faces when it meets something it did not expect: to lash out in fear and become smaller than they thought they were, or to hold to the thing they had said they were, and stay large. Mara had bet everything, her ship, her crew, her life, on the possibility that a civilization 900 years old had not forgotten how to be honorable when honor was expensive. She had bet on the enemy's character, and she had won. "They stood down," she said, and her voice cracked on it. "They stood down, the weapons cold, they're not going to fire." The command deck let out its held breath as one. And on the open channel, before the withdrawal, before any of the words that would enter the record of the assembly, the layered VSHTI voice spoke one line that never made it into the official transcripts, one line that Mara alone would carry, and would repeat, decades later, to a granddaughter who asked her what the aliens had really been like. "You are right," the patient contemplation said, very quietly, meant almost for the resolute alone. "We nearly forgot what we are. Thank you for reminding us. It is a strange thing to be taught honor by a species we came to mock. We will not forget the lesson or the teacher." And then, only then, did the giant turn to run. The hesitation lasted 11 seconds. Mara counted them, because on a ship dying by inches every second was a coin you spent whether you wanted to or not. 11 seconds in which the patient contemplation did nothing, its guns unfired, its confusion broadcasting to the stars. And then the layered voice came back onto the open channel, and it had reassembled itself into something colder and harder than the bored survey master who had first hailed them. "Terrestrial vessel," it said, "or vessels. We do not know your true number, and we acknowledge that we do not know it. This is a novel experience for us. We wish to speak plainly. You have blinded a portion of our sensory apparatus and multiplied your apparent signature through means we have not yet catalogued. These are the actions of a combatant, not a curiosity. We have adjusted our classification accordingly." A pause. "We are prepared to withdraw. We invite you to permit our withdrawal. We would prefer not to escalate an encounter whose parameters we no longer fully understand." Mara stared at her board. On the command deck nobody spoke. "They're asking permission to leave," Reyes said, very quietly, as though speaking too loud might shatter the moment. "Captain, a conquered capital ship is asking a human ship for permission to leave." "Because they've lost their model of us," Ajay said. His voice was soft now, thoughtful. "That's what Vance did to them. She didn't just blind them, she erased their certainty. A warship 4,000 times our size can afford to lose sensors. It can afford to take damage. What it cannot afford is to fight blind against an enemy whose capabilities it can no longer predict. They came here knowing everything about us. Now they know nothing, and knowing nothing at knife range against something that just embarrassed you is the one situation a rational commander does not gamble in." He looked at Mara. "Lieutenant, it's still your ship. What do we tell them?" And Mara Okonkwo-Vance understood that this was the real climax of the day. Not the pulse, not the fog, but this. Because the kettle was dying. She had 8 minutes of coolant and half of it was already gone. The drive was climbing toward its thermal limit even now, and every one of the false plumes she'd painted into the fog was a piece of the ship's remaining life burning away. If the patient contemplation called her bluff, if it decided to weather the swarm and fight, the Resolute would cook her own drive to death inside of 10 minutes and drift, powerless, and the giant would grind her to dust at leisure. Their whole position was a bluff. A magnificent, system-shaking bluff, and the VSHTI were offering to fold. The wrong move now was to gloat, to press, to demand. A human ship with real power behind it might make demands, but the kettle had no power behind it, only nerve and cleverness and 8 minutes of coolant, and the surest way to lose everything was to make the giant realize that the swarm surrounding it was a fog full of ghosts. "Comms," Mara said slowly. "Open a channel point to point, just them, not the broadcast." She thought for a moment. "No. Belay that, keep it on the open channel. Let the whole system hear this too." "You sure, Lieutenant?" Reyes asked. "I'm sure. Because that was the other thing, the thing Ajay had understood from the first minute. This encounter was never really about the patient contemplation. It was about the 1100 worlds listening in. The Concord had come to broadcast humanity's humiliation to the stars. The only fitting answer was to broadcast the reversal just as loudly. Rays keyed the channel. Ajay nodded at Mara. Speak. Mara took a breath. Patient contemplation, she said, and she was careful to keep her voice level, careful to sound like someone who held all the cards rather than someone playing a busted hand with a straight face. This is the terrestrial vessel Resolute. Not vessels, vessel, singular. A small pause to let that land, because the truth spoken plainly at exactly the right moment can be more frightening than any lie. There is one of us here today, one ship, one crew. You came to demonstrate the gulf between your capabilities and ours. We accept your demonstration. We have learned a great deal from it. On the channel, silence. She could feel 1,100 worlds leaning in. You classified us as a maritime curiosity, Mara went on. You were not wrong. We are crude. Our hull is welded by hand. Our weapons throw rocks. Our reactor is held in a cradle a man built with his own hands because he did not trust the drawings. Everything you said about us was true. She let the beat hang. And with that crude, welded, rock-throwing curiosity in the space of 4 minutes, we defeated your lance, blinded your forward array, and put you into a position where the rational choice was to ask our permission to leave. One ship did that. The first warship our species ever built, on its 3rd trial burn, before it was even finished. The command deck was utterly silent. On the scope, the patient contemplation had not moved. So here is what the Resolute tells the patient contemplation, and what the Resolute tells the Concord of Sapient Fleets, and what the Resolute tells every world listening to this channel, Mara said. You are welcome to withdraw. We grant your withdrawal freely and we wish you a safe transit home. We hold no grudge. We came out here today to test an engine and you have helped us learn what it can do, and for that we are almost grateful. Her voice hardened just slightly, just enough. But understand what you will carry home. You will carry home the knowledge that this is what we could do when we were crude, when we were a curiosity, when we did not yet know what we were building. Imagine, patient contemplation, what the second ship will do. Imagine the 10th. Imagine what a species that did this with hope and adhesive will do when it has learned to build the way you build. A pause. We are not asking you to fear us today. Today we are still a joke. We are asking you to remember today so that you understand what is coming. Resolute out. She closed the channel. For 3 full seconds, nothing. Then on the scope, the patient contemplation began to move. Not toward them. Away. The vast bone-colored hull swung its wounded flank around, its gravitic screening flaring as it gathered itself for a jump, and the layered voice came back one final time, on the open channel for every world to hear. Terrestrial vessel Resolute, it said. Your message is received and it is understood. The Concord acknowledges its error of classification. We came to this system believing we understood you. We departed knowing that we do not. This is the more honest position, and we thank you for it, though the manner of the lesson was not gentle. A pause that Mara would remember for the rest of her life. For the record of the assembly be it noted, the terrestrial species has entered the community of war-capable peoples. The date of entry is this date. The vessel of entry is the Resolute. Let it be recorded that they were mocked, and that the mockery was in error, and that those of us who mocked them lived to correct the record. Patient contemplation withdrawing. And then the giant jumped and was gone, and the space where it had been was simply empty. And the Resolute sailed on through a fog of her own cooling breath, alone, wounded, and utterly, impossibly triumphant. For a moment the command deck did not react at all. It was too large a thing to react to. Then Chief Vane's voice came over the intercom, and it was cracking. Lieutenant Vance. We've got maybe 6 minutes of coolant left and a drive that's running at 90% of thermal limit. I hate to be the one to say it, but we still have to get this ship home before we cook her. And home is a very long way away, and we are out of clever tricks and out of coolant and running on the last of everything. Mara laughed. She couldn't help it. It came out of her in a wild, ragged burst, and once it started she couldn't stop it, and across the command deck the others caught it, Havoc and Rays and even the captain, the helpless, exhausted laughter of people who had bet everything and won and now had to figure out how to survive the winning. "Okay," she said when she could speak. She wiped her eyes with the back of her glove. "Okay, Chief, shut down the drive, cold coast. We don't burn another gram of coolant. We drift home." "Drift home," Vane repeated. "On a ballistic arc. Lieutenant, that's a 9-hour coast. Range control's going to have a heart attack." "Range control can watch us come in slow," Mara said. "We're not in a hurry anymore. Nobody's chasing us." She looked at the empty scope, at the space where a moon-sized warship had chosen to run rather than fight her broken little ship, and something in her chest unknotted for the first time in 11 months. "Shut her down, Chief. Let her cool off. She's earned a rest." The fusion torch spun down. The endless singing of the kettle's 10,000 notes faded to a hush, and the acceleration bled away, and Mara floated free in her straps in the sudden, weightless quiet of a ship that was no longer trying to kill her. Captain Ajay unstrapped and floated to the center of the command deck. He looked at each of them in turn, Havoc, 19 and wide-eyed, Rays still wiping tears of laughter, Vane drifting up through the deck hatch grease-stained and grinning, and Mara. "When we get home," he said, "they're going to ask each of us to tell this story. Politicians, admirals, historians, aliens probably. They're going to want to know how a converted ore hauler stared down a conquered capital ship and made it blink." He paused. "I want you all to tell them the truth. The truth is that we didn't beat them with a better ship. We beat them with a worse one, a ship so crude, so improvised, so completely off the blueprints, that their perfect model of us was useless. Everything they knew about us was wrong because everything about us was held together wrong, and wrong in ways only the people who built it could predict." He looked at Mara. "The conquered build ships that are perfect. We build ships that are ours. Today we learned which one wins when they meet at knife range." "They didn't run because we were strong, sir," Mara said quietly. "They ran because we were unpredictable, because we were held together with hope and adhesive, and they couldn't model hope." Ajay smiled. "No," he said. "No, I don't suppose they can." It would be years before humanity fully understood what had happened in those 4 minutes beyond the karst line, not the mechanics of it, which were simple enough once you knew where the reactor really was, but the meaning of it, the way a single encounter had reached out and rearranged the assumptions of a galaxy. The historians would argue about it for a long time. Some of them said the Resolute had won a battle. That was wrong, and Mara said so every time she was asked, with a stubbornness that eventually became famous. There had been no battle. Nobody had been destroyed. A converted ore hauler had not defeated a VSHTI capital ship, in any sense the word defeat usually carried, because the ore hauler could not have destroyed the capital ship in 1,000 years of trying, and everyone involved had known it. What had happened was stranger and larger than a battle. What had happened was that the Concord of Sapient Fleets, an assembly of ancient civilizations that had spent 900 years supremely confident in its ability to measure, model, and manage every young species it encountered, had discovered, live, on an open channel, in front of 1,100 worlds, that there existed a kind of enemy it could not measure. And that discovery had frightened the conquered in a way that no weapon ever could have, because a weapon can be counted, and a threat that can be counted can be managed, and management was the whole basis of the conquered's long serene supremacy. Humanity could not be counted. That was the lesson of the Resolute, and it propagated outward through the network faster than the news of the encounter itself. The VSHTI had built the most precise model of a human ship ever assembled, and the model had been worse than useless. It had been a trap that the humans had turned against them, because the humans' own ship did not match its own blueprints, because the humans trusted the people who built things over the records of the things, because a species raised on hostile worlds had learned to improvise so thoroughly that improvisation had become its native tongue. You could not model a species like that. Every model was already out of date the moment it was made, because the humans were always, restlessly, changing the thing you had measured. And a thing you cannot model is a thing you cannot safely fight. This was the arithmetic that the Concord's member species now, quietly, began to run. In a straight fight, humanity's crude little fleet would be annihilated. Everyone still knew that. But no fight against humanity would be straight. That was the terror of it. The humans would fight the way the Resolute had fought, with whatever was to hand, in ways that made no sense until they worked, using their own weaknesses as weapons and their enemies' certainties against them. And a war against an enemy like that was a war without a predictable end, a war whose cost could not be calculated in advance. And the Concord had built its entire supremacy on never fighting a war whose cost it could not calculate in advance. So the Concord did what large, rational, ancient things do when they encounter something they cannot safely fight. It did not attack. It did not mock. It began, very carefully, to treat humanity as something that had to be handled with respect. Mara learned all of this slowly, in the months and years that followed, from the vantage of a career that the 4 minutes beyond the karst line had utterly transformed. She had gone out that morning, a lieutenant junior grade on a ship the galaxy called the Kettle. She came home a name. Within a year she was training the crews of the new ships, the real ships, the funded ships, the fleet that humanity built in the wake of the Resolute. And the first thing she taught every crew, before weapons, before tactics, before anything, was the lesson of the reactor cradle. They will scan you, she told them, again and again, standing in front of rooms full of young officers who had grown up hearing the story of the Kettle. They will build a perfect model of your ship, and the whole time they will not understand the one thing that matters, which is that a human ship is not the ship on the blueprints. It is the ship the crew has made it into. It is a living argument between what the designers intended and what the people who fly it actually need. Every weld you move, every system you rebuild, every fault you learn to turn into a feature, every one of those makes their model a little more wrong, and their model being wrong is your only real advantage against something 4,000 times your size. So make their model wrong. Build ships that are yours. That is the whole of the tactic. That is the lesson of the Resolute. The Concord builds ships that are perfect. We build ships that are ours. And when perfect meets ours at knife range, ours wins, because ours can surprise them and perfect cannot surprise anyone, least of all itself. The young officers wrote it down. Some of them, decades later, would teach it to officers of their own, and the lesson of the reactor cradle would outlive Mara Okonkwo-Vance by a very long time, and it would keep humanity free, one unpredictable ship at a time, long after the Kettle herself had been decommissioned and enshrined, and turned into the thing that every child in human space came, eventually, to see. Because they did keep the Resolute, that was never in doubt. They could have scrapped her. She was a wreck, half her systems dead, worth more as salvage than as anything else. But you do not scrap the ship that changed the shape of the galaxy. They repaired her flank and sealed her wounds, and they did not replace the slagged port battery or rebuild the vented coolant bay, because those scars were the story, and the story was the point. They set her in a slow orbit over Earth, the first world, where anyone could come and see her, and they left the stenciling on her flank exactly as it had been, terrestrial vessel Resolute. And underneath, added later in careful letters, someone had painted the 2 words that the whole galaxy had learned to stop laughing at: hope and adhesive. They kept the cartoon too, the smiling crewman with his tube of glue, transferred carefully from the mess wall to a plaque beside the airlock. Millions of visitors walked past it every year. Some of them laughed, the way the VSHTI had once laughed. And then, always, a guide would explain what those 2 words had come to mean, and the laughter would change into something quieter and larger, the specific human silence of people realizing that the joke had become the legend. that the mockery had become the epitaph of everyone who had underestimated a young and stubborn species that built its ships by hand and refused, absolutely refused, to break. The 9-hour coast home was the strangest passage of Mara's life. For the first hour nothing happened, and the nothing was glorious. The crew of the Resolute floated through their wounded ship in the quiet dark, patching what could be patched, breathing recycled air, saying very little, because there was very little that needed saying. Chief Vane crawled through the aft coolant bay with a repair kit and a flashlight clenched in his teeth, sealing the breach the HFY Lance had torn, and reported back that the old cradle, the empty decoy that had saved them all, was slag, and that he had never been so happy to see something destroyed in his life. Ensign Havoc, 19 and no longer quite the same 19 he had been that morning, sat at the nav station and plotted their long, slow ballistic arc home, and kept looking at the empty space on the scope where a giant had chosen to run. And Mara sat at her gunnery station and listened to the system come alive around them. Because the HFY had never closed the channel, that was the thing nobody had fully reckoned with in the heat of it. The entire encounter had gone out on an open broadcast to every world, every station, every ship in the terrestrial system, and now, in the hours after, that system was on fire with it. Reyes had the comms board lit from edge to edge, and she read the traffic aloud in a voice that grew more astonished by the hour. The colonies were calling. Every colony, every station, every backwater mining outpost that had spent 200 years living under the Concord's board and patient gaze. They had heard a HFY capital ship come to mock the human warship, and they had heard it broadcast, in its own layered voice, "We are blind, and were there always more of them, and the Concord acknowledges its error of classification." They had heard a 24-year-old gunnery officer tell a moon-sized warship to imagine what the second ship would do. And they were, all of them, losing their minds. Series Relay is asking for a full recording of the engagement, Reyes reported. So is Titan Station, so is the Martian Assembly, so is, she paused and her voice changed. So is the fleet, Captain, all of it, the other 10 ships. They're forming up. They want to escort us home. Tell them we don't need an escort, Ajay said. We're not being chased. They know that, sir, Reyes said softly. They don't want to protect us. They want to be there. They want to fly alongside the Resolute when she comes home. She looked up. The whole fleet, Captain, every ship humanity has. They're coming out to meet us. Ajay was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Let them come," and turned away so the crew would not see his face. By the 4th hour, the recordings had left the system entirely, riding the relay beacons out into the wider network, and the wider network was where things became strange in a way none of them had anticipated. Because the terrestrial system was not the only audience the HFY had broadcast to. The Concord's channels were open channels. And the recording of the patient contemplation's withdrawal, the first time in the recorded history of the Assembly that a species had entered the community of war-capable peoples, by making a capital ship flinch, was propagating across the network faster than any ship could carry it. The first alien contact came in the 5th hour. It was not from the HFY. Captain, Reyes said, and there was wonder in her voice. We've got a transmission, long-range relayed. It's from the Thren. The Thren. Mara knew the name from the briefings. A species older than the HFY, older than most of the Concord, a reclusive people who had joined the Assembly 1,000 years ago and had, in all that time, never once spoken to humanity. Never bothered. Why would they? You do not speak to an anthill. Play it, Ajay said. The voice that came through was slow and deep and strange, and it spoke to them directly, point to point, across the vast dark. Terrestrial vessel Resolute, it said. We are the Thren. We have observed your species for a long time, and we have never before found reason to address you. We find reason now. We have reviewed the record of your encounter with the 4th HFY reconnaissance wing. We wish you to understand what we understood watching it. The VSHTI did not withdraw because you were strong. You were not strong. They withdrew because you were something the Concord has not encountered in 900 years. A young species that fights, not with the tools it was given, but with the tools it can improvise in ways that cannot be predicted from the outside. This is a rare and dangerous quality. It cannot be modeled. It cannot be counted. It can only be respected. A pause. We do not offer you friendship. It is too early for that. We offer you acknowledgement. You have been seen. Welcome to the dark. Thren out. The command deck was silent. They've been watching us for 200 years, Havoc said finally, his young voice hushed. And they never said a word. And now we did one thing they couldn't predict, Mara said, and they crossed 1,000 years of silence to tell us they saw it. She shook her head slowly. That's what changed today, not the fight. The fight was 4 minutes. What changed is that the whole galaxy just learned that humans don't fight the way you expect. And a thing you can't predict is a thing you can't safely mock. And a thing you can't safely mock is a thing you start, very quietly, to treat as an equal. More transmissions came in the hours that followed. Not many. The galaxy did not turn on a dime, and most of the Concord's member species said nothing at all, absorbing the news in the long, slow way of ancient civilizations. But the ones that spoke all said, in their different ways, the same thing. We saw. We did not expect it. We will not make the mistake of the VSHTI. And underneath all of it, unspoken but unmistakable, ran a current that Mara felt more than heard, a current that would define humanity's place in the galaxy for 100 years to come. Fear, not much of it, not yet, but the first cold seed of it. The galaxy had spent 200 years certain that when humanity finally built something that mattered, it would be crude and predictable and easily managed. And humanity had built something crude, yes, but the crudeness itself had turned out to be the weapon, the very thing that made them impossible to model, impossible to counter, impossible to mock without risk. Every fleet in the Concord had watched a moon-sized warship turn and run from a converted ore hauler. And every fleet in the Concord was now, very quietly, recalculating. In the 9th hour, the Resolute came home. She came in slow and cold and wounded, drifting on the long ballistic arc Havoc had plotted, her flank scorched and vented, her port battery dead, her aft coolant bay a sealed and blackened ruin. She was, by any measure the Concord would recognize, a wreck. A crude, improvised, hand-welded wreck held together with hope and adhesive. And the whole human fleet was waiting for her. They had formed up along her approach corridor, all 10 of them, every warship humanity possessed, converted tugs and refitted freighters, and one ship that had until recently been a passenger liner, every one of them as crude and improvised as the Resolute herself. They had turned on their running lights. They had opened their channels, and as the wounded Kettle drifted home through the dark, they lit their drives in salute, 10 fusion torches flaring bright against the black, and the sound that came over the comms was not orders or telemetry or protocol. It was cheering. Mara floated at her gunnery station and listened to 10 crews cheer a broken ore hauler home, and she thought about the survey report that had started it all. Hope and adhesive. She thought about the little cartoon on the mess wall, the smiling crewman with his tube of glue. She thought about 11 months of learning to love a ship that kept trying to kill her, and she understood, finally, why she had loved it. Because it was theirs. Because they had built it wrong, and the wrongness was human, and the human wrongness had turned out to be the one thing in the galaxy that a perfect civilization could not predict, could not counter, could not model, and, in the end, could not do anything but flee from. Captain Ajay drifted up beside her. He watched the fleet's lights flare in salute, and for a while neither of them spoke. "You know they're going to build more ships now," he said at last. "Better ones. The assembly's going to fund us like they never have. In 10 years the human fleet won't be 10 converted tugs. It'll be real. It'll be feared." He glanced at her. "And every one of those ships is going to be built by people who watched what you did today. People who learned the lesson you taught the VSHTI. What lesson is that, sir? Ajay smiled. That the crude thing built by hand, off the blueprints, held together by the people who understand it in their bones, that thing is more dangerous than the perfect thing, because it does what its makers need it to do, and its makers are unpredictable, and the galaxy has no defense against being surprised. He looked back at the fleet's lights. The Concord came here to prove we were a joke. They flew away having proved something they'll spend 100 years trying to forget. That when a young species builds its first warship with nothing but ingenuity and nerve, when it fights with hope and adhesive and refuses to break, the right response is not to mock it. No, sir, Mara said quietly, watching 10 drives burn bright in welcome. The right response is to run. And far out beyond the karst line, in the empty dark where a moon-sized warship had chosen flight over a fight with a converted ore hauler, the record of the Concord of Sapient Fleets carried its new and permanent entry outward at the speed of light, to 1,100 worlds, and then 11,000, the words that would outlive every soul aboard the Resolute and define humanity's arrival among the stars. They were mocked, and the mockery was in error, and those of us who mocked them lived to correct the record. The galaxy had laughed at humanity's first warship. And then, one fleet at a time, it had learned to run.